So what I want to do first is review what we've learned so far. Okay, so we discussed the Roman Republic. And it was essentially an oligarchy, okay? So oligarchy just means rule by the few. So it's very much like Sparta. It is a war society. And at this point in history, the fact that the Roman Republic was an oligarchy, basically it had about 100 families that commanded it, okay? And these were called the patricians. It was actually to the advantage of Rome, because at this time, Rome was small. It was poor. It was at war, okay? So in other words, even though there was nobility, they were not that much better off than other people. And everyone knew each other. So they were very open, energetic, and cohesive society. And so over time, they became the most dominant society in the Mediterranean. They defeated Carthage, they defeated the Greeks. But now that they're an empire, the fact that Rome is an oligarchy is a huge problem. Because now they are corrupt, unequal, and stagnant. And one way that we know is Roman women just started to refuse to have children. Okay, so they were dying as a society. And at this point in history, what should happen is that they should build an imperial bureaucracy, a centralized, standardized system in order to better manage the empire. But they couldn't really do that because of the oligarchy. The families, which now are about 50, okay? They refused to give up power. So rather than a centralized bureaucracy, the Roman Empire was in many ways a system in which different families had different territories. And what this led to was constant civil war, okay? Civil war. And remember, it started with Sulla, and then it went on to Julius Caesar. And after Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar became the first among equals. But he still failed to set up the bureaucracy. Okay? And so it kept on leading to war. Eventually, what happened was that Constantine decided, this system doesn't work. So what I need to do is I need to reinvent the Roman people. And you do that by moving the capital from Rome to a new place he calls Constantinople, okay? Which now becomes the Byzantine Empire. Okay? And the Byzantine Empire now, because it's a new culture, it can now become a bureaucracy. In fact, their official language becomes Greek. It's a Greek bureaucracy. Okay? And this is what we call the Second Rome. At the same time, while this is happening, you have a massive migration of the steppes people. Okay? They're coming into Europe from many different locations. Why is this happening? Because in China, the Han Dynasty is waging a war against the steppe nomadic people. Okay? The people called the Xiongnu. So they're forced westwards, which forces the other steppe people to migrate into Europe and into Central Asia. Okay? So these people are called the Goths. And this becomes a huge problem for Rome because their people are not having children, and you have all these massive migration coming in from the steppes. And so what the Romans decided to do is divide and rule. And so what this means is that a lot of them are absorbed into the army as mercenaries and as soldiers in order to defend the border, in order to fight these civil wars. Now, remember last class we talked about the rise of the Catholic Church, okay? And we discussed how the Catholic Church was, in many ways, being supported by these noble families. Not all of them supported the Catholic Church, but some of them did. And those that did had a huge advantage because now what they can do is absorb these new migrants into the society, where they're at the top and the migrants are at the bottom, okay? Then the question then is, why would the migrants agree to this? The reason why is, in their society, it is very egalitarian. And for war purposes, they would elect a war leader, okay? But with this system, the Catholic Church system, this war leader can now become a nobility, okay? They can now join the 50 families to form a new nobility, okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right. So at this point in history, when Constantine sets up the Byzantine Empire, now the Roman Empire is going to divide into two: a western part and an eastern part. Okay. And these two parts are going to have very different fates. The eastern part is still part of the Middle East, okay? The Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, and so it is the wealthiest part of the empire. And as such, it engages in wars with the Persian Empire, okay? And this will define most of its history. Its capital, Constantinople, was designed to be invincible. You could not lay siege to it, you could not conquer it. And as such, the Byzantine Empire was stable. In fact, it lasted for about 1,000 years, which is very, very impressive. Okay, and as I said, it's very wealthy, and so therefore, it's really able to dominate the world through mainly trade and diplomacy. Okay? So it became an imperial bureaucracy. It fought wars, but it usually used a lot of mercenaries because it had a lot of wealth. Right? So that's the Eastern Empire. And guess what, guys? This is very similar to China, okay? So think about China when you think about the Byzantine Empire. They're not the same, but they're very similar in how they organize their society. The Western Empire is very different because this is the poorest part of Europe. The other thing about this region is that there are lots of natural barriers. And so you have like these competing societies emerging, okay? Different cultures, different societies, and they're protected by mountains, by forests, by rivers. So there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of diversity within the Western Empire. And so the power that emerges is actually the Catholic Church. And as Western Europe increases in power and Eastern Europe decreases in power, the Catholic Church will increase in power as well, okay? How did the Catholic Church come to dominate Western Europe? Because the Catholic Church believes it is out of history. Okay? So you kings, you compete for who rules the earth. But we, the Catholic Church, we decide who goes to heaven. Okay? So the Catholic Church becomes the dominant power in Western Europe. In fact, you can say that they are the empire now, but they are a spiritual empire, a divine empire that is out of history and which speaks for God. And as such, they become a very powerful empire as well. Okay? And this leads to tremendous conflicts throughout Western Europe. Okay? But there's a problem with the Catholic Church, and we discussed this last class. With the Catholic Church, it's trying to control the divine spark. Remember, Jesus came to tell us that there's a divine spark in us. And as long as we try to glow this divine spark, we can be with God. And the Catholic Church says, no, no, no. This divine spark, it is that of the devil. And we must imprison it. Okay? And this works most of the time. But now and then you have religious leaders who arise and said, no, no, no. The divine spark is within us. And so this leads to a lot of conflict. And ultimately, the solution the Catholic Church proposes is the idea of crusades, where warriors go and kill those who believe in the divine spark. And then they set up a secret police called the Inquisition in order to search for those who oppose the Catholic Church. Okay? The Inquisition, the major idea is, if you believe in the divine spark, you're not an evil person, you're a stupid person, because you don't know better. So the idea of the Inquisition is to educate you in the truth, which is the divine spark is that of Satan, that of the devil. And therefore, you must obey the Catholic Church. But if you insist on defying the Catholic Church, then you are a heretic. And therefore, you must burn at the stake before you can pollute other people. Okay? Now, eventually what will happen is that as a conflict in Western Europe gets worse and worse, certain states will break away from the control of the Catholic Church, and they will embrace a new religion called Protestantism, okay? And this is something we'll discuss next class. Okay, so that's the history of Western Europe. Okay, so now I want to talk about Constantine and the rise of the Byzantium Empire. So Constantine is, what he does that's very important is that he makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. So before Constantine, you had Christian emperors, but they did not make Christianity the official religion. But he made Christianity the official religion. Okay? The problem, though, we discussed this last class, is that Christianity is a franchise model. So different churches teach different things. And so Constantine was like, no, we can't have this debate. If we'll make this the official religion, what we need to do is have one orthodoxy, a unified ideology, okay? All right, so at this time in history, there are two major debates, or two major sources of confusion. The first is what we call Christology. What this is the question of like, what's the nature of Jesus? Okay. Remember, the story is that Jesus is in heaven, then he comes to earth, Mary gives birth to Jesus, then Jesus preaches his message, the gospel, then he is killed and he is resurrected. And then he returns to heaven, okay? That's the official story of Christianity. But there are lots of problems with this story, as you can imagine. If Jesus is divine, how did Mary give birth to Jesus? Right? If you're a human woman and you give birth to a God, that means that you're God yourself, okay? All right, so who is Mary and what is her power? Second question then is Jesus divine or is he human? Okay? Because if he's human and he dies, that's a sacrifice, right? But if you're divine, you can't die, so his death and his resurrection doesn't make any sense. Okay? So this is the problem with Christology. Is Jesus human or is he divine? And there are different interpretations, okay? The first interpretation is Jesus is divine in heaven, but he's human in the world. Okay, does that make sense? So yes, Mary gave birth to Jesus, but she gave birth to the human Jesus and not the divine Jesus. Because you cannot give birth to the divine God, okay? And that's why his death makes sense, because the Jesus who died was the human Jesus, but once he died and he was resurrected, then he went to heaven, okay? That's one explanation, that Jesus is really human. Another explanation is No, Jesus is divine. So Mary, the death doesn't really matter, okay? He's just divine. Okay? So both are possibilities. What the church says officially is Jesus is human and divine at the same time. Okay? This is the official ideology of the church. This makes no sense, guys. All right? But that's what you're taught. And so there are a lot of, course, people who are like, this is a stupid idea. Okay? And these people are called the Nestorians. And they were persecuted by the Catholic Church. And so they went to Persia. Okay? They went to the Middle East, they went to Persia, they went to Arabia, where they spread the message of Jesus. They taught Jesus as a human as opposed to a God. They taught that Jesus was a messenger. Okay? Which is what I taught you, right? That he's really a messenger of the monad. All right? So, does that make sense? Okay, now the second debate is actually even more confusing than the first debate, okay? And it has to do with the nature of the three powerful forces, right? The three gods. You have God, the ultimate God, then you have Jesus, then you have the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is God expressed in the world. Okay, so when someone speaks to you, you think it's God, it's actually not God, it's the Holy Spirit. All right, so now the question then is, what is the relationship between these three? God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. And again, there are different explanations. And they kind of make sense, okay? So the first is the idea of modalism. Modalism is the idea that Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are just different modes of the same thing. They just change. So when Jesus is in heaven, he's God. When Jesus comes to earth as a human, he's just Jesus. And then when Jesus wants to communicate with us, he's the Holy Spirit, okay? So remember, Paul talked to Jesus. But Paul didn't really talk to Jesus. Paul talked to the Holy Spirit. Okay, so it's the same force, but expressed differently. Okay, that makes sense, right? Second is the idea of partialism. Partialism is just the idea that God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, are all part of the same divine force. Okay, so think of an ocean, right? The Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is huge, but there are different parts to it, right? So that's the idea of partialism. That makes sense too, right? Okay? And the third idea is the idea of Arianism. And Arianism is just the idea that God came first, and then afterwards he created Jesus. So, in other words, Jesus is God, but he's second to the real God. Okay? That makes sense as well, right? Now, there are problems with all three, okay? The first problem, modalism, is if you read the Bible, Jesus talks to God, Jesus talks to the Holy Spirit. That's kind of confusing because why would Jesus talk to himself, okay? So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the Bible, okay? So this doesn't really work. Partialism doesn't work either because if you think about it, if God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit are part of a divine aspect, then that divine aspect should be God, right? Not these three. Okay, this doesn't really make sense. And Arianism doesn't really make sense because the entire point of Christianity is to say that Jesus is God, right? We worship Jesus, not God. So if you're saying that God's superior, why shouldn't we worship God instead of Jesus? Okay, so this is problematic as well. So what Constantine did was he organized all the bishops of the different churches to come to Nicaea. It's called the Council of Nicaea, okay, in order to come up with a solution to this problem. And this solution is actually even more problematic than these three, okay? And it's called the Holy Trinity. So let's go over the Holy Trinity. What the Holy Trinity says is this: God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, they are separate, okay? But they are equal. They are separate, but they're part of the same thing, okay? They're both separate, and they are equal to each other, okay? Now, if you think about it, it makes actually no sense whatsoever. The only solution to this problem is that this Holy Trinity is both nothing and everything at the same time. It becomes reality on to itself. Okay? And the only way to understand this is to accept this as a reality. All right? So I know this is confusing, but think of the idea of money, right? Okay, so the idea of money is both nothing and everything. Okay, money is nothing, but it can be everything at the same time as well, because it symbolizes wealth. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So none of this actually makes any sense. And the only way that it makes sense is if you force it to make sense, if you just memorize it. So think of math class, okay?